Thank you for coming to our panel presentation. Today I'll be talking about nationalism and masculine spaces within science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or what we refer to as STEM. Just a little caveat before I start my presentation. When I was doing this analysis, I'm trying to bring together kind of two historiographies simultaneously. One talking about masculinity more broadly in the United States and science education. And because I'm, at least to my own knowledge, the only person to kind of link these two historiographies, I wanted to include as many intersectional points as I could. However, in doing this kind of first analysis, I found that incorporating race and class might have been too broad of an analysis for this kind of first go. So you'll kind of see that this, obviously STEM is more of a masculine and white space, and I'm not neglecting kind of that intersectionality, but for this, at least first analysis, this is kind of what I'm going to give you the first go around. So kind of contemporary concerns and historical backdrop here. So the amount of women in STEM, or lack thereof, remains a concern for educational policymakers. For instance, President Obama has commented on this concern, and in a 2013 Women in STEM report from the Department of Commerce found that women only made up 24% of the STEM workforce. So I'm going to be looking at the launch of the Soviet satellite Sputnik 1, which I will now refer to as just Sputnik. And it changed the trajectory of science education in America, making this militaristic and kind of nationalistic approach to science education a priority, and also set this precedent for kind of federal intervention that we're kind of more used to in our contemporary times, and as well as standardization. So basically the conclusion that you could kind of make on a surface level is we live in a patriarchal society that is dominated by white men, and therefore if these careers in STEM are highly valued, then white men are going to be the ones that get to inhabit those spaces. And while this is true, I feel like there is a little more to the story. In history, nothing is ever going to be that clear-cut. So my historical question is, why is it that this masculine space within STEM seemed to solidify during the years following the launch of Sputnik? And what I'm going to be looking at is the contributions from popular culture, which emphasizes the science and space exploration that were directed toward boys and young men, that helped after the launch of Sputnik, that helped to solidify this space. So I have a lot of kind of popular culture references, but for brevity of time, I'm going to just kind of do one of each. So like I said, I'm kind of linking this historiography of masculinity in America with science education, while also using kind of Judith Butler's feminist theory on the performativity of gender. So looking at it from this perspective, if gender is performative in the kind of everyday interactions that we have with each other, then kind of popular culture depictions of gender and how gender is acted out is either going to kind of reflect the popular or normative notions of gender expression, or going to kind of be an indoctrinating device to kind of guide people along to this is how you should kind of express your gender. And so, looking at Michael Kimmel, he's a sociologist that does a lot of work with masculinity. He kind of, in his chapter talking about the Cold War, he kind of notices that a lot of men have this anxiety after World War II about how to express their masculinity. And he called it this fear of gender failure. So, this is a quote from Michael Kimmel. "American men discovered what happened to men who failed, especially the sons of men who failed. They became homosexual, they became juvenile delinquents, and they became communist, soft, spineless dupes of a foreign power who were incapable of standing up for themselves." So this is kind of the attitude that many kind of men are holding after World War II, kind of this fear of, gender failure, and more importantly, failing the gender expression of their sons, right? That becomes a very important kind of role for them. And this is kind of, the kind of aspect of Butler's theory that I'm kind of utilizing more heavily. So the first kind of instance of popular culture is from Life magazine's Crisis in Education series. So this is a 3-part series after the launch of Sputnik that kind of looked at how American education was failing And as you can see, we're talking about school boys. So even though we're talking about a crisis in education in general, it's becoming very clear that that crisis is a failure of masculinity. And linking kind of the education is masculine, right? So in this first issue, we're looking at Alexei and Stephen. So Alexei is from a school in Moscow, Stephen is from Chicago. And I'm gonna show you a few pictures of both. And I kind of want you to, it's gonna get interactive. I want you to look at kind of things you notice, things about Stephen, things about Alexei, and what you think the authors of this article are trying to do. So we're first going to look at Alexei. So there's Alexei with his English book standing in front of the picture of Lenin in the background. Here's Alexei kind of doing his own science experiment. So you can see that science is going to be kind of a heavily featured part of what Americans view as Soviet education. And there is Alexei playing the piano, kind of in his extracurricular activities. Let's look at more pictures of Alexei. So there's Alexei playing volleyball, so emphasizing kind of a sports around masculinity. Here's Alexei doing more science. And there is Alexei playing chess with his mentor. So is there anything about Alexei, just off the bat, that you notice, some kind of like a theme throughout all the pictures? And I know the answer if no one wants to fess up. But Alexei never smiles. So if we go back, there's never a picture of Alexei showing any sort of kind of happy emote, if you will. So that kind of reflects kind of the ideology of what, Soviet masculinity is. It's kind of this more stoic, militaristic ideology that emphasizes science and, in the extracurriculars, it's sports, it's playing chess with your mentor. It's a lot of these high-valued kind of extracurricular activities. Let's go to Stephen. So there's Stephen in class. Just kind of a candid picture of him walking around. Here's Stephen. This is the only picture that Stephen kind of comes into contact with science. They're basically just looking at pickled, I believe they are guinea pigs in the jars. And then there's more pictures of Stephen. There's Stephen on the typewriter. And in the caption that's kind of cut off here, it says that Stephen brags about his 10 words a minute type speed. There's Stephen getting outside help in geometry, his worst subject. And Stephen walking either to or from school with a female companion. So as you can see, there's a lot of pictures of Stephen smiling, right? So that kind of is reflective of kind of the subtle differences that the authors of this article are trying to make between what is kind of Soviet masculinity and what is American masculinity. And what happens if we fail in education, if we're having this crisis. So now I'm going to move on to a comic series called Space Conquerors, which premiered in Boys Life magazine, which is basically Life magazine, but aimed toward boys. So this is one episode of Space Conquerors, and as you can see, all the protagonists are male, and they are white, and they fly past what they think is a space rock, which they later find out to be a piece of kind of human-made machinery. And they see that there's a dead dog in the capsule. A direct homage to Sputnik 2, which the Russians set up with a dog that presumably died in space. And as you can see, near the end, one of the protagonists says, she died so we could conquer space. So kind of putting this idea out that space is something to be conquered, and that in this comic in particular, we are literally going past what the Soviets had done, right? Because we are floating past their satellite. So just moving on to comics more generally, Captain America and Superman are decidedly anti-communist, pro-American, but there are certain details of their stories, such as the transformation of Lois Lane, that are particularly noteworthy. So Lois Lane starts out as a career-oriented and savvy journalist, However, as the 1950s progress, she transforms into this woman that is obsessed by the idea of marriage and tricking Superman into marrying her. Certain comic book heroes such as the Green Lantern and the Flash were actually rebranded after Sputnik's launch. For instance, making the Flash a kind of scientific policeman, if you will, and he is literally the embodiment of America's containment policy because he cannot be contained. And what I'm going to focus on in particular are the Fantastic Four. So the Fantastic Four came out after the launch of Sputnik, and if we kind of look at the origin story of the Fantastic Four, right, these are 4 American scientists going out into space, and they run into a cosmic storm where they all are granted superpowers. Now, the males in the Fantastic Four are given kind of very masculine and militaristic superpowers, right? Like, Mr. Fantastic can stretch his body and kind of envelop anything that he would desire. The Human Torch can fly and catch on fire. The Thing, it has the his skin kind of adapts, and he gets super strength, and he can kind of be impervious to damage. And the only woman scientist gets the cloak of invisibility. So saying that if a woman scientist is to be granted the superpowers that are kind of given with space exploration, they are to be invisible. Moving on to television, so The Twilight Zone had this episode called Two, which kind of depicted the gendered expectations of the Cold War ideological conflict. So it's set in this post-apocalyptic wasteland where you have one man, one woman, and even though they are not specifically rendered on either side, it becomes clear that the man is American, so you can see in the movie poster, the man in the movie poster, his uniform matches the man, and the woman is wearing a uniform that you particularly associate with Eastern European communist countries. So already setting the tone as communism is feminine, right? So in their first interaction, they're unable to understand one another, and the woman attacks the man, seeing him as an enemy. So unable to communicate with her, the man knocks her unconscious. So kind of on television, in one of the more popular television shows, not only kind of endorsing violence against women, but showing it by your main protagonist. But eventually, so that's a picture of them fighting at the beginning of the episode. But like any 50s television show, they end the episode as lovers. So kind of showing that, the gendered politics of the Cold War are going to be won out by the American, which is masculine, right? So moving on to Adventures in Science, which comes from the title of my presentation, it triggers the atom bomb, don't they? So Adventures in Science was a radio program that would end soon after Sputnik, but it gave girls that were interested in science airtime, but it became clear that this airtime was not equal to the airtime given to men. So we have Marianne Joswick, who actually won the Science Talent Search, which is the kind of talent search that Adventures in Science kind of covered, but she encountered she made a metallurgy project, and the announcer quipped something to the effect of, "That's not an occupation for a young girl, isn't it?" So even though that she won the competition, it's still viewed as, this isn't your place. There's also Janet Roundtree. Janet Roundtree did not win, but she made her own kind of detergent, kind of like out of chemicals that she made around the house. And the announcer asked if that was her way to get rid of the wash day blues. So the Science Talent Search in general continues through today. And even though Jane Shelby presented a project on the orbit of Sputnik based on her amateur observations, she did not win. She finished 3rd in her year. And despite having a female winner in 1945 at the end of World War II, young women remained out of the top 3 from 1958 until 1971. So in this period, it is clear that women are going to now be excluded from science and talented science. So just in conclusion, this kind of sets the tone for conversations that we have today about like popular culture, toys, Barbie dolls, Legos, and like how that interacts with science education, and how that these episodes kind of popular culture emphasizing the masculine and science, technology, can kind of have a direct impact on how many women we actually see in those fields. And those are some of my sources. Thank you.